being a leader means knowing where you're going as one of the key pieces. You know, this was part of lead by example. You have to know where you're going. Well, you can't know where you can't know where you're going unless you know what's going on. So you have to know something about the problem in order to be able to lead in an environment where there's a problem. And so I'm going to have to break down woke for you a little bit. What is woke? I'll make it as simple as it needs to be. There's a lot. We could talk for hours. I mean, literally, if you want the deep dives, I've got over 500 hours of podcasts on this subject recorded, available for free at any time that you want on my website, which is newdiscourses.com. You can go find that. This is for when I dry out in a minute. Woke doesn't have to be made complicated. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty, some people do. That's great. We need people that do that. That's what I do. We need more. I need an army of people doing what I do to make it so I can do other things. But the fact is, all you need to know as a normal person about woke, who is not going to deep dive into this or that has other roles to play in this fight, which is almost everybody, is woke means calling everything that you want to control oppression until you control it. So you find something you want to control, like the schools, like a politician, like a church, like anything that you want to control, a person, and you say, you're racist, you're transphobic, you're homophobic, you're contributing to a system of patriarchal oppression. This is it. It is taking anything you want to put under your control and calling it some name that's related to oppression until they give in and you control it. Our university systems fell to this in the 1960s. That's a big part of how we got here. Our university systems produce the knowledge in our society and disseminate the knowledge in our society that goes to our professionals, that informs our everything at the highest level, all of our institutions at the highest level. Do you think that if you wanted to work for, who trusts the CDC? Okay, good. Let me ask you a question. Out of all the people who work at the CDC who aren't sweeping a floor, how many of them went to college? All of them. And there you understand their entire strategy. If they got a hold of the colleges, they get a hold of every professional job downstream. And this translates into the religious world too. If you get a hold of the seminaries, then you get a hold of every pastor downstream. And what happens then? Well, imagine this. Here's how it works in education. If you get a hold of the college, you get a hold of the College of Education. If you get a hold of the College of Education, you get a hold of the teachers. If you get a hold of the teachers, then you get a hold of the students. And what do you have if you have hold of the students? The future. We're not supposed to point out that Adolf Hitler quoted and said this. He said, "He who gains the children or the youth gains the future." What if you want to control the soul of a nation? How do you do it? Well, you capture the seminaries and you capture the pastors, and the pastors stand in a corrupted pulpit and pervert the soul of a nation Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And I don't think that's happening at this church from what I've seen and what I've heard and what I know, but we've seen the pictures, we've seen the videos, we've seen the evidence that this is happening in many churches. We know that we were told that loving your neighbor, as Jesus commanded, somehow means wearing a mask and not talking to your neighbor at all and reporting your neighbor to the authorities for going to the store without, proper social distancing or whatever, or failing to get a vaccine. We know that we had church doctrines perverted. We know that we're supposed to embrace the intolerable, the mutilation of children, for example, in the name of loving tolerance that Jesus allegedly taught. Let me just tell you, folks, I'm not exactly a theologian myself, but Jesus drove out the demons before he accepted the person. You have to start with the truth. So now you know how they did it, but what is it? Woke is just Marxism that evolved to attack Western society. We have a good society. In the 1960s, the Marxists were writing it. They were saying, you know what's wrong with capitalism? It's that Marx was wrong about capitalism. This is really what they said. I can name names. Max Horkheimer, the founder of the idea of critical theory. Herbert Marcuse, the biggest rock star that the left had in the 1960s, became called the father of the new left, had millions of disciples around the world. In fact, there's a CIA document I saw the other day for the first time talking about the radical movements in the 60s, and it was written in the 1970s. And they said, the summary, as far as this guy, Herbert Marcuse, who maybe you've never even heard of, they said there are three characters we have to pay attention to looking at the radical movement. Marx, who is like their God, Marcuse, who is his prophet, and Mao Zedong in China, who is his sword. And so that's the spirit of the revolution that we're being put through right now. What's happening in this country is a cultural revolution using Marxism. But the problem was, as they recognized in the 1950s and 1960s, they said, and this is an exact quote, capitalism does not immiserate the worker, it allows him to build a better life. The problem, Herbert Marcuse specifically said, is that it builds not just a better life, but a good life. It's truly a good life. And so he said the working class is never going to revolt in a successful society with advanced capitalism. That's what he said. So what did Herbert Marcuse's big plan, what was his big strategy to solve this problem? He said it's really simple. We'll find a new working class. We're going to find it in the outsiders. We're going to look around American society, and we're going to find who's not winning, who can be convinced that they don't have a chance, and we're going to agitate them. And he identified certain categories of people. He called them, as a group, the ghetto populations. And he said, we'll use racial minorities, we'll use sexual minorities, we'll get feminists, we'll get drug addicts, we'll get all of the people who are on the edges of society, criminals. And what we'll do is we'll radicalize the idealistic college students to go connect with them and bring them Marxist doctrine that makes them understand why they can't succeed like everybody else in American society, and will turn them against their own society. And so he said in 1972, same guy, we need to infiltrate education at all levels and bring our ideology into every profession. This was called the Long March Through the Institutions. It's a phrase you maybe have heard. Well, where did these ideas come from? These ideas came from China. They came from Mao Zedong, who I just mentioned is supposedly the sword of Karl Marx. Okay, so a lot of people don't know a lot about Chinese communism. You know why? Because the communists took over our schools and we don't teach the history of communism. I bet you every person, except maybe the youngest in this room, has read a book or two at some point in their education about the horrors of the Nazis. And as we should. We should learn about that. We should learn about how evil fascism can be, how destructive. And I bet you've not read a single story that's like that about the horrors of the communists. I very frequently, in fact, in North Dakota, in Minot a year and a half ago, Amber was there, Babito was there, so she can testify that this is actually what I did. I started asking the room. We had maybe, 150, 200 people in there, and we started asking. How many of you have heard of the Cultural Revolution? How many of you have heard of the Holodomor? How many of you know Lenin's first name? I have to pause because somebody there did it too. John. It's not John. It's a different Lenin. Probably both communists, but a different Lenin. Slightly different spelling and everything. And I asked all of these different points of Chinese history. Who knows what the Great Leap Forward was? Who knows what happened? And the answer is, and I'm not asking for an explanation, but show of hands, and it turns out that for any of these questions, out of 200 people, 5 or 6 people raise their hands because we're not learning about these things in school. These are major historical events where, for example, there's one that most of the audience, or half of the audience almost, raised their hand for. I said, who's heard of the killing fields in Cambodia? And more people raised their hands. And do you know why? Did their schools teach them about the killing fields? No, there's a movie. There's a movie about it. So it has nothing, again, to do with the school. So this is what I said. I said, listen, what we have is red-washed education in this country. We have education that's not teaching our children, which includes, I'm in my mid-40s, me, so I was children decades ago. I didn't learn anything about communism in school. I thought it was some economic system that's different than capitalism that they had at the Soviet Union. The end. That's all the detail that I learned about it. I didn't know what it means. I couldn't tell you the difference between communism and socialism or their relationship. I couldn't tell you what it thinks. I didn't know that it was tied to Marxism or how. None of this was covered in my education that I got at the third best public high school in the state of Tennessee in the 90s. We have completely red-washed education. And so we don't know what we're facing, and we don't recognize what we're facing. But here's what Karl Marx said about communism. It's on the first page of a book that many more people should have read, which is called the Communist Manifesto. People have heard of it, but they haven't read it. You don't have to read that much. It's boring and repetitive, to be honest with you. But the first paragraph on the first page isn't even that long, and he says what communism is. He says it's not an economic theory, by the way. It's not at all an economic theory. He says all of the movement of history is reduced to the conflict between classes. And he gives freeman versus slave and a couple of different examples, rich versus poor. And then he says, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. So when you see the oppressor versus oppressed, here's an entire class of people, and they oppress this other entire class of people, and they're in an intrinsic conflict in society, and we have to liberate the oppressed from their oppression through revolution. You're dealing with Marxism. That's the essence of the whole program. That's the heart and soul. And what have we, imagine if your average school children that went to school in the 90s and early 2000s knew that. And that communism was responsible for the death of anywhere between 1 and 200 million people. The killing fields in Cambodia, for example. Do you know that Pol Pot, that's the guy's name that was the communist that was in charge of that. Did you know he killed 3 million Cambodians in his reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge? So 3 million. You think about the numbers that I just said, like 100 million. It's 3. It's just a drop in the horrible, ugly drop in the bucket, right? Well, you got to remember that's 25% of the population of the country. Imagine if these people, the woke, took power. And by the way, Pol Pot did all of it in the name of, guess what? Social justice. That's the exact wording he used. It was all in the name of social justice. Imagine if 1 out of 4 Americans was murdered in the name of the social justice movement. Would that open people's eyes? But imagine if the average American knew that this language we heard from critical race theory, where it's white versus people of color as two intrinsic classes that are in conflict, oppressor versus oppressed, or straight versus gay, or male versus female, or normal versus queer, in the technical term of queer theory, which is the doctrine of the sexualities politics. If they had knew that those were the things that are the same thing that's on the first page of the Communist Manifesto, and that same idea was espoused and pushed in the name of something called social justice, just like it is today, and that led to the deaths and destruction of lives of hundreds of millions of people. Imagine if everybody going through school in the 1990s and early 2000s had learned that, and then this thing pops onto the scene in 2015. Imagine how loudly this country would have said, no, not here. They had to trick us. They had to fool us. And that's why it's so important to understand what this is. Because communism is not an economic theory. It is a religion. It is a religion that thinks that it has the sole right to seize the means of production of history itself, which means seizing the means of production of society and seizing the means of production of man, who we are, how society is going to condition us and structure us to be who we are. You ever hear that word, social construction? Because the social environment constructs people, and it structures who we are. The language is very intentional once you learn to read what they're actually saying. They are trying to seize the means of production of history because they think that they know what the correct end of history is, which is that we're going to live in a communist utopia. And it turns out that the reason they think that is because Karl Marx was answering a religious question, not an economic question, with all of his work. And that religious question he's answering is, who are human beings? What is our purpose in life? Isn't that a question that you expect to hear in a building like this, not in a university campus? Would you expect to hear that question in an economics classroom in a university? Or would you expect to hear that question in a church? Who are we? Why are we here? Those are not economic questions. Those are religious questions. And Karl Marx had an answer. We're a perfectly social species. Just not everybody knows it. We all live for one another and give to one another in perfect harmony, but we have this problem. Because we have private property, we think we're individuals that don't have to do that. And now we're in it for ourselves rather than in it for each other, and we forgot who we are. Does that sound like the story of the fall of man? Because it is their story of the fall of man. This is a religious architecture. And what is our purpose? Our purpose is to go out. For them, it's very much like a Great Commission. It's to go out and to awaken people to the consciousness of who we really are, and to the fact that as social people, as social beings, I should say, we are also historical beings. If you read Marxist anything, you're going to see historical process, historical this, historical beings, historical people. What does that mean? It means people who move history. It doesn't mean people who are located in history. It means people who make history. So their goal is to awaken people to the consciousness that there is this history to be made, and you make it, and it's made by conflict between oppressor and oppressed. And by the way, you're probably oppressed, so you need to enter the war against the existing society to destroy it, to seize the means of production, to take it to the right place. That's all of it. It is a religious movement to take man back to what they think is his intrinsic nature, which is to literally to enter back into the Garden of Eden on our own terms. Man makes man makes man. That's Marx's idea. There is no God in this picture. God is the opium of the masses. He's thrown down. He says, in fact, in the famous Opium of the Masses paper, which is called A Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. It's one of the first major public things he published, 1843, at the very end of the year. Young Marx, 24 years old, writes this, the famous, the religion is the opium of the masses. Down a couple paragraphs later, he says that the point of all criticism starts with criticism of religion, and the purpose of all criticism is to stop letting man be in a position where we revolve around religion as a false sun, and instead that we place ourselves as the true sun that revolves around itself. It is a self-centered, me religion. And how do you get people to sign up for that? You say, well, they don't want you to have it. They are keeping you from it. You would have a perfect life where the government and everybody else would take care of you all the time. You could do your art and get a living for it. You could go wander in the park and it's considered value. You could do all of the things. You don't have to take any responsibility. You don't have to build any skills. You don't have to grow as a person or in character or in leadership. And everybody would take care of you, except they don't want you to, and they are making you work that terrible job at Starbucks so that you can make just barely enough money to make them lots of profit. Keep you going so that you can make them rich and you don't get to have any of it. And that's how you convert people to that religion. Through envy, through sloth, through resentment. And you get them worked up, believing that they're entitled to Eden, literally without having to work for anything. And that it's the people on top in society that are keeping them from it. And it's all it takes. People who are having bad luck, people who are young and idealistic and think it could work with other people's money forever, they buy it. They see a better world. They see the problems. What Marx called it was ruthless criticism of all that exists, which he based on a line from a play. The play is called Faust. You maybe have heard of the play Faust. It was the rendition written by a very famous German poet. It was an old folk story, but Goethe, who's a German poet, wrote the story Faust in maybe its most famous form. And the story of Faust is that Faust is a man who's very down on his luck. He's not getting what he wants out of life. It's kind of like the Cain and Abel story a little bit. Cain's not getting what he wants out of life. Well, Faust isn't getting what he wants out of life, so he makes a deal with the devil. He sells his soul. So Mephistopheles is the character that's the emissary of Satan, comes, signs the contract with him, And all of a sudden, Faust starts getting everything he wants. He gets the job, he gets the money, he gets the glory, he gets the fame, he gets the girl that he wants. He gets everything he wants in life. And Mephistopheles is teaching him and empowering him and everything else. The story ends tragically. It's very much like the story of our president when you sign a deal with the devil. Then the story of Faust. The devil takes your soul before you die, and you're left as a powerless, empty shell who thinks you got everything you wanted in life but has nothing. It's a very interesting commentary on our times. But Marx got the idea of the ruthless criticism of all that exists from a line in that play. And it's a line out of the mouth of Mephistopheles, which is to say the mouth of Satan. And the line is, all that exists deserves to perish. And that's the mind behind Marxism. That's the religious commitment behind Marxism. Or as Karl Marx phrased it, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. This is a religious war. That's why it feels like a spiritual war, because it is a spiritual war. And so what is Marxism? You probably can't leave here and answer that, because I gave you a complicated answer. Let me give you a simple answer. Just like I gave you a simple answer for woke, calling everything you want to control bad names until you control them. And specifically calling them oppression until you control it. Critical race theory, calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. So what is Marxism? I'm not going to give you the same definition. Marxism is a cult. It is an evil cult of destruction and selfishness. It is an entitlement complex turned into a religion. The exact opposite of the gratitude, the humility that's exhibited in Christianity. It's in fact Christianity turned upside down and inside out, and turned as evil as it could possibly be, no longer centered on God, but centered on self, in the name of everybody else who's supposed to actually be serving you. So Marxism is a cult, and we've been fighting it like it's an economic theory. And now, just imagine, think of I know some of the people in the room are a little young for this, and their education probably didn't cover it, but imagine Jim Jones, right? He had a cult, and then they took off to Guyana. And what happened at the end of the cult with Jim Jones? Well, it got infiltrated by the CIA. The next thing you know, they all drank the Kool-Aid, because the Kool-Aid only works if everybody drinks it, and it's supposed to take them to the next spiritual plane or whatever. Turns out the Kool-Aid was poison, so they all committed mass suicide. Imagine if a cult like that took over the federal government. And in fact, not just the federal government, but the United Nations and the federal governments, therefore, of 193 nations around the world, all at the same time. Imagine that situation. Because Jim Jones wasn't a weirdo religious cultist. Jim Jones was a communist. There are letters of support, radio broadcasts of support from one of the most strident communists of his day, reaching out in support for his commune. Angela Davis, in particular, has a very famous radio broadcast she gave in full support of Comrade Jones. Jonestown was a communist cult commune. Now, I'm going to scale that up to the size of the United States and the entire Western world, and you know what's happening, and you know how it might end. Not to be too graphic, but we actually have at this point, it just happened recently on Reddit, on these internet forums, where you have very disaffected, very aggrieved trans people who are saying that maybe the way to get their way is to have a gigantic publicity stunt where they commit mass suicide, all at the same time. Jonestown. This is a cult. We have the largest cult startup in human history trying to take over the globe right now. And welcome to the battle. And if you're religious, as my friend Jason Preston from Utah says, if you're religious, you got to realize that you got stuck here on earth in the middle of this for a reason. As he says, God didn't send his second string to this fight, which means you're on the first string. Now think about, I know we heard about sports all morning from the pastor, and he said stuff about ice. I come from the South where we don't have that. I'm just kidding. I was born in northern New York. My cousin actually almost made it to the NHL and would have, but he ended up with a tumor on his hip and had to quit skating because of a medical error. But imagine if the first string said they were going to sit on the bench. How would the game go? And what we've had, the reason we're in the position that we're in right now, partly because we didn't even know the game was happening, we didn't know the rules of the game, we didn't know the strategy of the other team, is that we've had the first string sitting on the bench all along, and only in 2020 did people start saying, hey, maybe I should get up. Maybe it's time. My journey, and now I'll switch to kind of leadership stuff. You know what's going on. What's happening is a cultural revolution, just like happened in China. Mao used identity politics. Marcuse stole the idea. He didn't come up with it himself with these ghetto population stuff. He stole Mao's idea of creating enmity between groups through identity politics, where you set up pressure. You don't want you want people to become revolutionaries, so you demonize them for being something normal until they pick up a revolutionary identity. In our day and age, you tell these poor kids, you're complicit in systemic racism, your ancestors did all this stuff, your skin color, it doesn't technically make you bad, but it makes you bad, feel bad and guilty for who you are. Oh, you can't change that. But did you know we have all these weird new gender identities and sexual identities? You can become very radical in that if you want. You can become an ally. You can become an activist, or you can actually just transition and become an outright member of the entire new movement against all of this oppression that you're now led to be believed that you're part of. That was a Mao Zedong strategy. He didn't use race and sex as the tools. He used whether you were wealthy or not, whether you were a conspiracy theorist, they called them bad elements, whether you were a right-winger, we call them deplorables today. It's the exact same model. We call them anti-maskers, we call them anti-vaxxers, we call them deplorables, we call them fascists, we call them domestic extremists, we call them conspiracy theorists, we call them racist, sexist, homophobes, transphobes, and all the rest. And we call them, I had another really good one that'll really get your point, climate change deniers. We call them these names, and though everybody else is on the right side of history, so we just don't listen to those people, we take away their right to speak. Alex Jones is crazy, throw him off of the internet. Somebody else is saying uncomfortable truths, so wreck his company. That'd be Elon Musk. Elon Musk bought Twitter. Whoops, now Tesla's a racist company like the next day. This is the game. And what it is a gigantic communist revolution that doesn't look communist because they're using corporations to do it instead of using a bunch of working class guys that they got angry. They're using racial minorities, sexual minorities, feminists, outsiders, and outcasts, and criminals, and now an entire proletariat they imported across the border. An entire new working class they imported literally across the border, and they're telling them all those houses will be yours. All that stuff will be yours, and they're giving them a taste of it. Just wait till they jerk the taste away. What's going to happen? 20 million, mostly military-aged men who just had their promise revoked from them. They're going to go berserk. They've imported the other side of the revolution, and this is what's happening. So now you know what's happening. So I got caught onto this before 2020. I don't want to say like I became some perfect genius either. I totally got sucked in. I was cleaning everything at the beginning of 2022. I had my mask on. I totally fell for it until about May. So they had me for a good 2.5, 3 months. I'm not going to claim that you become totally inoculated to a psychological active measure put forth by the government against its own people overnight because you're starting to figure some stuff out. I totally had Trump derangement syndrome. That was another big psyops they gave me. Oh man, November, whatever the day was, 2016, I was in the floor. I was like, oh, it's all over. I was like, do I have to go delete all the things I've written online because free speech is over? I was totally hysterical, totally fell for it. But I actually figured out about that woke was happening much earlier. I figured out woke was happening probably by late 11, early 12. I gave my first public talk in 2017. So let me reiterate a point many people made about leadership earlier, which is patience. It was 5 years of me working on this before I got on my first stage. And in the middle of that talk, a lady sitting about right over here stood up and yelled at me that I was totally wrong in the middle of my first public talk about the issue because it didn't fit her preconceived notions about, a talk was about social justice, and I was talking about all these cultural issues like race and sexuality and so on, and she said social justice is a matter of economics. You know what I was talking about? Totally derailed me. What happened, people ask this question all the time, how'd you go from being a mathematician to a thought leader in the anti-woke movement, travels all over the world and speaks? Well, people were wrong on the internet. That's where it started. I was a normal guy. I wasn't a university professor. I got sick of the university. I finished at the university in 2010. I was sick of it. I didn't like the politics. I didn't want to work in it. So kind of a first lesson in what led me not knowing what I was doing to the point where I am today was saying, I find this working condition intolerable, so I'm going to figure out something else. And I didn't know what else I could figure out. So here's something a lot of people do. I've worked 10 years on this, right? I've put all this effort in. I put 13 years into a PhD in math. They don't give those away. I had a tenure track job in front of me if I was willing to play the game, set for life, so to speak, blah, blah, blah. I didn't want to play the game. I didn't like the game. And so there's this thing in the world called sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost. You've sunk all this cost into the thing, so you can't let it go. Say you've got some junker car you're going to fix up into a hot rod, and you've put $20,000 into it, and it turns out it's just a junker car. It's never going to become a hot rod. Well, you put $50,000 more into it. There's a movie back when I was a kid called The Money Pit about a house that was like that. This is the sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've already invested 13 years in becoming a professor. I have to become a professor, but I didn't. I left, and I became a massage therapist. I started working with my hands. I started deciding to help people directly through some weird story is how I ended up in a position where I was qualified to go off to massage school and do something. We don't have to get into it. I had back pain. Massage fixed it. I learned the techniques. I was already doing it. My wife was like, dude, just go get your massage license. You're really good at this. And I was like, okay. And so I was at massage school when my PhD came in the mail. I came home to find my diploma indicating that I had reached the pinnacle of education after I came home from massage school, rubbing oil on somebody's butt. And so there's a lot of being open to change directions, admitting that what you're doing is not something you have to continue doing, and that you're not too proud to do something else. I could have got haughty about it. I'm not going to work as a massage therapist. That's beneath me. I have a PhD. I got told that all the time. How could you have a PhD and work as a massage therapist? Really? A masseuse? Heard it all the time. But I thought, no, this is helping people. And I've overcame that. And what it turns out is the massage therapy, I will be very honest with you, is a fun job. It's a good job. It's a meaningful job. It's a challenging job in a lot of ways. But it gives you a lot of free time. And it's not very intellectual. And as I did really get a PhD in math. I got bored. I needed an intellectual outlet. So I started reading these books about philosophy, and I had some friends, and they were on these discussion forums, and I'd go talk about the books. We'd argue about ideas, and it was a lot of fun. It was an outlet a couple hours a day. I'd mow the lawn, I'd take care of the kids, do whatever in the house, do my 2 or 3 hours of massage, clean up, get the laundry going, and go hash it out on the internet. And as it turns out, this is where we get to a lot of people were wrong on the internet. And in particular, what was happening was a lot of people were feminists on the internet, which is redundant to what I said before. A lot of people were wrong on the internet. And they were calling everybody sexist for everything. And I was so confused. So I finally, and this is another very interesting character, I think, to leadership. I was very curious as to what in the world they meant. I could have just yelled at them. I could have thrown my hands up and left. I could have just, put my head down. Could have done whatever. But instead I asked them, what the heck are you talking about? Send me some resources so I can figure out where in the world you're coming from. And then I read them. I got curious. Why are these people saying this crazy stuff? At some point in the last couple of years, you must have looked at something happening in a school and said, why is that there? And the next question after that is, well, that didn't just start. Somebody had to push for that, and then somebody had to approve it. And where in the world, these things all have a history, they all have a story. And if you become curious about the story, what's going to happen is you're going to learn about the story. And when you learn about the story and you learn about the ideas, you become informed about them, and then people will start listening to you. So now you're in that relationship with the follower and the leader. We heard earlier from the senator that if you're a leader with no followers, you're just out for a walk. Well, it turns out that if you start making sense of something that doesn't make sense to people, whether it's that you can solve a problem in their regular life, whether it's that you can make sense of feminists on the internet, which good luck with that, people will follow you. I had a following on social media that started to grow. I had a reputation that started to grow for the articles that I was writing, and I switched to explaining that mostly. Turns out on my side hustle at the time, which I wasn't making any money doing, was my side interest, I should say, was studying cult psychology. So it turned out to be a really lucky choice. It really helped that I learned the psychology of cults and how they operate kind of at the same time. But what I learned was that these people are crazy, that their literature doesn't make any sense. And I specifically said, I came back after I studied this, I said, okay, I get it. There's this thing called systemic sexism, but you just called Sam a sexist. And Sam didn't do anything sexist. And they said, it's the same thing. I said, no, there's two definitions. And they said, no, it's the same thing. And I said, no, I went totally mathematician, which is a cute way to say autistic in that moment. And I was like, no, really, there are two definitions. They really don't mean the same thing. And then I got called a man. Well, you're a man. You couldn't possibly understand. And I was like, sex confirmed. Okay, thank you. But this is when I decided that this is something, I wasn't going to dedicate my life to this. It's just some idiots on the internet, right? But I'm going to kind of keep an eye on it. I read some of their literature. I thought it was crazy. I was like, well, what else is out there? That curiosity kept pushing me. So I started to read some of the peer-reviewed academic literature in these fields, and I started running into crazier and crazier things. I mean, I can't even say some of the stuff up here. I couldn't say it on a stage. I couldn't say it in a church. I definitely couldn't say it on TV, but I could say it to your kindergartner if I put on a wig and a dress, right? But these ideas were everywhere. And so I started talking to a friend, Peter. His name's Peter Bogosian. I started talking to him. He was noticing the same thing. So all of a sudden, here's another thing. You go check yourself. This is that accountability part. Hey, am I nuts? Like, this looks insane. And he said, no, I think the same thing. And he said, I actually just got off the stage with the famous magician. He's kind of a famous philosopher. I got off the stage with the famous magician, Penn Jillette. You know, Penn and Teller, the Penn. I got off the stage with him, and we got talking about gender studies, and I said, he said, I think it's a religion, and the literature, the academic literature, works like their Bible. It's like, not in the sense that it's a holy scripture for real, but in the sense that it's their authoritative source they always turn to. So you say, hey, you know, I don't think that's true. And they say, well, here's a citation, and here's a citation, here's a citation. And they give you the papers where, you know, Candace West and Don Zimmerman said that gender is a thing that you do, not a thing that you have or that you are. And so it's a doing process. It's a project. It's an activity. It's a performance, actually. And so they have all these citations. He said, I think it works like that. And I said, I think the same thing. So we got talking about it. And then finally one day, the intolerable happened. We're reading the literature, and this group of scientists or researchers or something from the University of Oregon published a paper about making the science of glaciology, studying glaciers, of course, for climate change. In order to solve climate change, they said we have to make the science of glacier study feminist. And we have to incorporate art projects, like studying. There's a feminist woman who paints pictures of glaciers, and one of the complaints in the paper is no scientists study her paintings, but they study pictures from satellites. I'm not making this up. And I thought, since I really was a scientist at heart, I was like, oh my God, this is making it into the sciences. This is serious, right? This is really serious. Of course, I was bought into the climate change psyops at the time too, so I was like, that's not going to solve climate change. That's bad. They're going to derail the whole project. And so I got really worked up about it, and Peter got worked up about it, and we finally decided there's only one way to deal with a corrupt cult body of literature, which is to prank it, to write fake articles and pass them off as a real thing and show they can't tell the difference. So we wrote a series of fake academic articles, which I can't talk about on this audience because they have PG-13 to R and sometimes X themes. They're very adult. They're very funny. You should look them up. One of them I can mention, we rewrote a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf as feminism and gave an 8-point plan for creating solidarity that came straight out of the mouth of Adolf Hitler, and that got accepted by a feminist social work journal. We were really successful with these pranks, but in the process of doing, and it was really great fun. The most fun I think I've ever had in my life. Highest stress I've ever been under too. But in the process of doing this, one of our papers was actually about education. And we thought what we were going to do, obviously. So another thing I learned is sometimes adjust your expectations and don't get too discouraged. We thought we were going to expose academic malpractice, which we now see, thanks to Claudine Gay, is everywhere. we thought we were going to expose academic malpractice, that this was going to shake the foundations, of start getting people asking the questions. No, it turns out they all just put their heads in the sand. But one of these papers we wrote was about education. And so in the paper about education, what we wrote was that there's all these privileged people, like white people and straight people and so on, and what we need to do is abuse them out of their privilege in classrooms. But we'll do it with compassion, because we want it to be funny. And they wrote back, and they said, we love this idea. But you can't use compassion, because you might recenter the needs of the privileged over the oppressed. And I thought, oh my God, this ends in genocide. I had learned enough about Mao at the time, about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I was like, an entire class of people has to be abused to fix the problem that they're too privileged. I also had learned enough, because I did learn about the Nazis. I was like, this is the exact anti-Semitism conspiracy theory, but turned on white people and men and straight people. It's the exact same logic turned back again. I'm like, this ends badly. And so a necessary quality of a leader is courage. It's a very important quality of a leader is courage. So I went to my wife and I said, honey, I think that this unravels civilization. Can I quit my job and spend all my time studying it? And my wife looked me dead in the eye, and being a woman, that's the whole joke. We're old school. She looked me in the eye and said, can you make money doing that? And I said, I don't know. And she, being a woman, said, well, I support you. You have 18 months to figure that out. But I stress, she's really female. Not like I'm protesting too much female. She's actually female. So 18 months meant 15 months. I had to borrow money from a friend to pay myself my first fake salary check to say, no, it's working, I promise. And we got the plane off the ground. We started making enough money to pay real salary checks a couple months later, and I paid my friend back, and everything worked out fine. But there was a lot of big risk-taking involved. I saw a meme on the internet the other day, and it said how people think the world works, and it shows this guy all beaten down, and it has work piled up on him. And how the people think the world works to get ahead. Work, and the guy's all beaten down. And it shows another guy climbing basically a stairway into the sky, and what it says on every one of he's setting down his own stairs as he's walking. He's got a big stack of them, and every stair, it maybe isn't the right word to use, but it says gamble. In other words, take a risk. I dare you to go ask your wife to quit your job because you think that the world's going to end. Take a gamble. And it's worked out. I get to rub it in her face every day. I did yesterday, because now I even get paid to tweet. I go on Twitter. Twitter pays me. I got paid yesterday on the plane. I got the note. I took a screenshot, and I said, see, I wasn't wasting my time. I was preparing for our future. I was investing. You have to make investments. You have to wait for them to pay off. You have to be willing to take risks. You have to have the vision. I think that's in your Hebrews 11. You've got to be able to have faith that promises, or that sacrifices will deliver, and take those risks if you want to be able to lead. These are things that you have to do. And ever since I started to study it more and more, I had a friend who said, have you ever read this guy, Herbert Marcuse? And I already told you about him. And no. He was like, why don't you go read this? I came out the next morning. I went and read it before I went to bed. I came out the next morning a changed man. I was like, oh my God, we live in this guy's world. And he's like, okay, now you're ready. And it was very much like the Matrix, like weird Morpheus, take this pill moment. But literally, that up until that moment, I was saying, it's not communist, it's just something different. And then I came out and I was like, it's communist. This is communism. And then I was off to the races, because at that point, I had now taken advice from people who knew more than I did. I'd taken some risks. I'd built some stature. I'd opened myself up to learning more, to admitting I don't know everything, but that I'm going to try to find out everything that I can and give myself to this, and to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the next thing you know, I'm a thought leader. A few years later of just following that rabbit trail, and people like you invite me all over, not just the country, but the world. I spoke a year ago at the EU Parliament. If you want one speech to understand the problem, it's the best speech I ever gave. This one's terrible comparison. It was the best I've ever done. It's the best I'll ever do. Go look up my speech. It's 28 minutes long at the EU Parliament. It'll clarify everything that's happening in the big picture for you. How this is communism, how communism evolved to attack the West, how it moved from economics to race and all the other stuff. And this is what I get now, because I took all of those chances, and I was humble, and I asked questions, and I was curious, and I took advice, and I put myself out there. And let me tell you, I got called names, I got attacked, you don't even know. I've been attacked by everybody, by every side. I've been smeared, I've been canceled. I've been canceled so many times, I've been canceled from being canceled. I got kicked off of Twitter permanently. I am still kicked permanently off of Facebook. I've taken a lot of the shots. I celebrated when I got kicked off Facebook. I didn't want to be there anymore. My business partners were making me stay there we have an audience there. I'm like, shut up, I hate this place. But it was a bit of a blow when I got kicked off Twitter. I really used that. And, you know, I've been smeared. You pick the name, racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe, every day. I faced the split in my family. And you keep going. And so the biggest piece of advice, people ask, you know, like, what's your advice? I just put a little short podcast out about this a couple weeks ago. The biggest piece of advice that I learned is, turns out, it's in the Bible. Wouldn't you know? In fact, it's not even like in the corner in the Bible, you know, there's 850,000 words in that. It's not even in like some book like Malachi that, you know, yeah, you'll read it someday. It's not even in one of those. It's love the Lord with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Turns out it's a really big message that everybody who's even culturally aware of Christianity is familiar with. Only what I learned is that if we take John 1 seriously, where the Logos was with God and is God and became flesh in the person saying that. So if we take a little poetic license and say the lesson is that you have to love the truth with all of your heart and all of your mind and all of your soul and all of your strength. And you must tell the truth to your neighbor as you would have him tell the truth to you. Live and walk in the truth. Then you can do this. That's what it takes. Because I can tell you the way out of this, the way you fight this on a local level, is to tell the truth. Tell the truth to your kids. Tell the truth to your teachers. Stop being afraid. Tell the truth to your, your politicians. Tell the truth to the guy at the grocery store. People used to ask me, what do you do? And I would say, I didn't want to tell them. I tell people now. I was on Joe Rogan's podcast. You know, you don't buck Joe Rogan. He's like the alpha dog of the whole deal, right? And he's like, we're talking about Admiral Levine. We all love Admiral Levine. If you don't know who Admiral Levine is, his name is Richard. And he said, blah, 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 she. And I, without even thinking, said he. I corrected Joe Rogan with a misgender, as they call it, on a 10 million person podcast in the moment, because you tell the truth. You always tell the truth. But if you only tell the truth, one day they're going to put something on you that you don't want to lose. It'll be your job. It'll be your hockey team. It'll be a scholarship. It'll be something. They're going to harass my kids. And so what you have to do is you can't tell the truth. It's not enough. You have to love it. And you should probably fear it. Beginning of wisdom starts with fear of the truth. Otherwise, you're going to jump off a bridge. Truth is, you're not going to do good. You should fear the truth of what's going to happen to you. But if you love the truth, you will tell it. You'll also seek it. You'll get curious. You'll want to know more. You'll make sacrifices to have the opportunity to do it. You'll fly away from your family twice a week to tell other people all over the world about it. You'll see other people telling the truth, and you'll help them. You'll back them up. You'll support them. Your pastor will get attacked, and then somebody will corner you, especially these politicians. Well, what do you think of him? You be in the media, and you say, oh, yeah, I know that guy. I think he's great. He speaks the truth. He speaks the truth as well as he can. I love it. And you'll stand up for that because you'll defend other people who seek and speak the truth as well. So you got to really get right with yourself on that. And then you have to ask yourself about the truth of yourself. Are you a leader? And this isn't one of these moments. I'm not Tony Robbins. You're not supposed to all say yes. You might not be. That's okay. If you are a leader, you need to have that moment with yourself. Look yourself, can I lead in something? Can I lead in my family? Can I lead in my community? Can I coach? Can I lead in my church? Can I lead in this? Can I lead in that? Can I lead in something? Can I go run for office? God forbid. And the answer might be yes, at which point it's now something you got to live with. Shy away from the calling at your own peril. But the answer might be no. And you have to be honest with yourself, ruthlessly honest about it. Like people ask me about like the legislators always want to talk to me. And I'm like, I don't even know how to read the stuff you guys write. I don't know how to do that. I cannot lead you in legislation. I don't know how. There are brilliant people for that. So you've got to figure out your gifts, and you have to lean into them and lead where you can lead. And guess what? Maybe you're not even a leader. But a guy who's a leader who doesn't have any followers is just a dude taking a walk. So find somebody worth following and follow them. Because if you love the truth, maybe you don't have, I met a guy in Wisconsin, and he said, I'm not smart enough for any of this, but I know how to do copies. I know how to help lay out the chairs for an event. I know how to pick people up from the airport. I know how to do emails. I know how to do all the kind of, scheduling stuff. And so that's how he gives. And I guess that makes him a bit of a leader that he stepped up. But at any rate, he's following around a guy in Wisconsin who's changing Wisconsin, or who was. I haven't kept up with him recently. But find people worth following and follow them. Learn from them. Find out new things from them. And then start doing something. Test yourself. Stop sitting on the bench saying, am I ready, am I ready, am I ready? Try. And what you're going to do, as my goofy, dorky friend used to say, is you win some, you learn some. And when you start learning a few, you actually start finding things that you might be able to contribute. Then you might figure out that you actually are a leader. You just didn't know it yet. You were a guy fighting with people on the internet because you were bored, because you're a massage therapist with a PhD. And the next thing you know, you actually have something to say that people want to hear. I didn't start out in 2012 saying, I want to be a guy who travels all over the country and tells people about communism. I just wanted my friends to stop getting called sexist, and when that couldn't happen, I wanted to know why they were getting called this name, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and I just followed it and followed it and followed it and didn't shut up. And I have 500,000 people, at least on Twitter, that follow me, so I guess that makes me something of a leader. And I am here today to share that message with you. This is all that it takes. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, documenting the Soviet Union and the tyranny there and the fall there. And one of the things that he wrote, among many of it's a long book, by the way. One of the things that he wrote was, a single person willing to speak the truth can bring down an entire tyrannical regime. A single person. There are a lot more than one single person in this room. Another piece of advice, you're like, well, I don't even know anybody. Well, you speak to 2,000. Because you tell somebody and they tell somebody, and the next thing you know, it gets in the ear of somebody like me. I'm saying it on a podcast that's getting downloaded 10 million times because I thought it was profound. So you don't know where your message is going to get and where it's not going to get. I steal from people all the time. I'm as bad as Claudine Gay, I'm just kidding. I always give credit where I can. So I'm glad you guys brought me out here to talk to you about this. This is, I think, the essence of leadership. This is what my life has brought. And what we need is, we have a crisis of leadership. We need people getting up off the bench. This is the fight for this country. I'm not going to get eschatological about it. That's not my role. But this is the fight for America. This is it. This is the actual challenge. And it's not yours to ask why you were born into a position where you're in that fight. It's yours to rise to the occasion of the day and do what you can to make sure that the side of good wins. And I know it's the side of good because communism is an evil cult. Thank you. I'll take questions for the last few minutes.
Hi, Dr. Lindsay. So when you see a particular group that doesn't listen to logic, what do you think the best way is to address them?
Okay. I'm going to answer straight from the Bible because I'm at church. So in Matthew chapter 10, if I remember my Bible right, Matthew chapter 10, verse 14, I might be off plus or minus 2 because we make allowances in my world. The numbers were added later. What Jesus said is that he wants you to go out and to proclaim the truth and go to the different households when you find a worthy household to go in and tell them the truth and, commune with them and so on. But when they won't receive your message, shake the dust from your feet and leave that place. And then he says something that sounds a little bit like a curse upon the people who don't want to listen. Okay, so I actually encourage you this. This is a strategy that takes a lot of discipline to figure out, and it's actually a very important leadership skill in general, so thank you for asking that. If you tell 100 people, there's this thing you've probably heard of called the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people are probably going to kind of come with you a little bit, 80% probably not so much. And of that 20%, 20% are really going to come with you, and 80% are kind of be wishy-washy. So this breaks down mathematically to, out of 100 people, about 4 of them are going to actually hear what you said. And what you're going to think is, how do I get those 96 more motivated? And that's at the heart, really, of the question. And the answer is you shake the dust from your feet. You put your resources into the 4. You put some of those resources into that 16 in between because they kind of came along. You nourish the people who are coming with you. You feed them. And what you've done with the others, you say, well, what about the rest? You've proclaimed the truth. You've fulfilled what you need to do. It's not their time yet. Let that idea that you put in shake around. Well, I hear this from families a lot. My daughter this, my father that, my brother this. They can't listen to me. They won't hear me. I'm at my wit's end. Yeah, because you're trying. You're trying too hard. The job isn't to convince your brother. That's not your job. Your job is to tell your brother where you stand and make sure he knows as a family member that he's always welcome when he's ready to talk. That's all it takes. And you go invest your energy in more productive things and in people who are ready and willing to come along with you. So I urge you, in that case, to worry less about the people who can't hear you and put more effort into the people who are hearing you. And that's how you build a movement. That's how you get people together. That's how you end up getting enough people to go show up, just like the left does. They get people to show up at these protests, and then they get them to show up and go vote for things or to go yell at or harass politicians. Don't harass politicians or yell at them. You can do better than they do. But that's how they do it. They focus on the people who are coming with them, not the people who are going against them. And I urge us to do the same thing. Don't worry about them. Let them catch up. We could do this from the book of Judges with Gideon too if you want. It's a little harsher story, but if they don't know how to drink water, they're not in your army yet.
Thank you for being here. I've had it posed to me several times, and I wonder when people ask, define the difference between Marxism and communism. How do you split them, or do you consider them one and the same, or how do you do that?
Okay, now we go to the college mode. This is hair splitting, and it doesn't really matter, but they are different words. They do have slightly different meanings. Communism is a bigger picture. Communism technically means, I didn't give you the technical definition because it doesn't matter. Communism technically means that the means of the goods and services and products and means of production of society are collectively owned by the community. So there's no state involved or anything. So it's a vision for a societal order, an economic order. Marxism is a theory and doctrine of communist implementation. So that's the technical difference. There is no communism that's meaningful in the entire world ever anywhere since the 1850s that's not Marxist. The Marxist method is all that matters. And when we say communism, what we mean, and when we say socialism, we follow Lenin. Lenin said that socialism exists to move to communism. Communism is the end goal of the doctrine of Marxism. And so Marxism is a theory of what communism is and how it's to be implemented. But they're synonyms.
Hi, my name is TPUSA. I'm from Bismarck. So I am homeschooled, and I was supposed to read a book as part of my homeschool curriculum that has a little bit more of a liberal bias, and it was saying that Karl Marx advocated against things such as censorship, among other things, and was kind of implying that he himself didn't even align with Marxism. And so what would you say to that?
This is a cute way of replying to you, and thank you for your question. Thank you for coming. Communists, this is a rule everybody needs to have in their head. Just I want you to really pay attention to this. Keep it in the back of your head. It's going to be very familiar, but it's a little like, it's an aphorism. So it's, the words are kind of cooked. So you got to think through the words a little bit. Communists share your vocabulary, but they do not share your dictionary. In other words, they use the same words that you do, but they don't mean the same thing by those words. You might have noticed that diversity doesn't have a whole lot of diversity of political opinion involved. And it doesn't seem to even have to do with skin color, because Larry Elder's the blackface of white supremacy, right? And you might notice that inclusion doesn't feel very inclusive most of the time. In fact, it's almost explicitly about excluding things they don't like, right? And things that disagree with them or that might expose them. So that's a very important thing to understand. So when it says that Marx was against censorship, yeah, he was against censorship of Marxism. He was against censorship of his own ideas, but he was perfectly for the idea that other ideas would not necessarily be allowed to be promoted. Now, I'm being a little bit glib with that answer, because Karl Marx literally, like when I say it's a cult, he was all the way in his cult. Okay, so Karl Marx believed fundamentally that Marxism is the true, absolutely perfect science of history, and so that his belief was everything would prove Marxism is true, right? And if that's actually true, you don't need censorship, because everything will point back to Marxism. Lenin was a little bit more explicit about it. He wrote a book in 1917, which is the year he took power. It's called State and Revolution. It's a difficult book, but in the 5th chapter, he explains very clearly that that's not how this works. He says, we always talk about democracy, he says. He says, we talk about democracy, and everybody has a voice, but in reality, we're not all equal. Some people have more money. They have more of a voice. They have social prestige. They have more voice than other people. So what we actually have is what he called bourgeois democracy. We have democracy for the privileged people and the rich people, but it's not for everybody. Remember what I said is they don't want you to be able to participate in full. So what he said we need is an ideal democracy. And an ideal democracy is just like we think of democracy, but where everybody's equal first. So in other words, what we need, an ideal democracy means communism. Okay, so now democracy, you think about when they say defending our democracy, Donald Trump and Elon Musk are threats to our democracy and so on. The internet is a threat to our democracy. They mean communism. But what he said is the way that we will achieve the ideal democracy in the meantime is to have what he called proletarian democracy. And proletarian democracy would mean censoring and removing the right to vote and removing the property from people who were in the bourgeois classes. So Lenin said you have to censor the voices of the privileged or the people who disagree with us so that the people who agree with us can have their voices heard. And so when they say that this was, that not Marx specifically in this case, it's a little more complicated because he was a total cultist. When we look at communists and they say, well, we're the ones against censorship, what they mean is they're against censorship of their ideas, but the privileged ideas have already been heard. So it's funny because I told this personal story about how I got here. The exact conversation that kicked me over the edge wasn't even one of the wrong online conversations. It was in 2012. I was out with a mixed group of friends. I had my blue-collar buddies from my martial arts club, and I had some of my university buddies who were not so much that, and you can tell the politics were going to not be in line, but I was too naive to realize this, and we all kind of went out at the same place at the same time, and they ended up in a fight. This one guy working at the factory was talking about what he thought was an affirmative action hire on the floor that was going to get somebody hurt who didn't know how to run the factory right, shouldn't be in that job. And of course, what did he get called? Racist. Immediately got called racist by one of my university colleagues, and they got in a fight, and I tried to intervene. So this is about the censorship, I promise. I tried to intervene, and I said to the woman, listen, I talk to you all the time, and I know that one of your big themes all the time you say is, we have to hear everybody's story. This man's telling you his story, his experience at work, and you don't want to hear it. And her response to me, to my face, this wasn't online, to my face was, he's a white man, his story has been told. Which means he's censored. So censorship for people who disagree with us, they're all right with that because it's liberatory for getting rid of censorship in their crazy misinterpreted word or understanding of the word. It frees up the censorship for them to say what they want and have no opposition to it. So that's what when you run into that, it's very difficult to read things that have been tainted by left sources because they're using words wrong. So they'll pull you into, the word Mark's used for is mystification, which the word in the Bible is a capital D, deceiver, deception. They will deceive you about what the true meaning of the communication is and get you confused about what it is. So I do recommend, by the way, reading enemy sources if you want to understand, if you take that path. And I think young people should be exposed to starting to learn it. But you have to understand that you're reading a book of code. You have to understand that the words are being used to deceive you. So when you get that feeling like something doesn't square, the question you want to train yourself, young people in particular, to ask is, are they using all these words the right way? And if not, how might they be using them differently? And if you can work through that, you can start to decode them, and it all starts to make sense. So, sorry, that's a long answer to what seems like a straightforward question, but there are no short answers with actual digging into Marxism.
Hi, Dr. Lindsay. My name is Lillian. I'm a student here in Bismarck, and I was wondering how I can continue to be a leader through Jesus Christ when I'm going to school every day with a lot of cruelty and sins and not followers of Jesus Christ.
Well, I mean, leadership starts with you, and I mean that not in the cutesy way like, other people follow. I mean with you. Lead yourself, right? So you know your principles. You just articulated that you can distinguish or discern between the principles you know that are right and what you're surrounded by. So reflect on that. Don't be corruptible. Stay involved in your church to make sure that you're getting checked and corrected. We heard earlier where people that are good people with good Christian backgrounds made mistakes and they were able to learn from those. You want to be positioned for that. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to be perfect. The idea of the United States is that we have self-governance, so we govern ourselves, and then the local government is supposed to deal with what people can't deal with for themselves in between people. The state deals with in between that, and the federal government's supposed to deal with in between the states and the foreign powers. And so the idea is that we're supposed to govern ourselves. So you have to start by leading yourself. In other words, by keeping your principles and not being that worried about the world swirling outside and around you. And ask yourself every time you get invited to something, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this an experiment worth taking or an experiment better avoided? And don't sweat it. You'll make some mistakes. As long as you're committed to reflecting and learning from them, that's okay. But if you're checking in with yourself and staying accountable, like we keep hearing, then you're already being a leader. Because if you're holding to your principles, and it's like, it used to be these really cheesy videos that we used to watch where I'd be coming up to you on TV, it'd be like a commercial at the end of the show and be like, hey kids, you want some drugs? And they're like really obviously cheesy. But the idea is that when you get tempted by your friends, say peer pressure, I'm not even saying, hey, do you want to do this? Something really obvious. Just peer pressure to go along with something. And you say no, you're already being a leader. Actually, I'll tell you the secret of leadership. The biggest word of a leader is no. Because people want you to do stuff all the time, and you have to be able to say no to this and no to that. So if you're doing that, you're already showing your schoolmates, your classmates, that you're not corruptible by the peer pressure, that you're not that you're comfortable in yourself and you're in your values. So you're leading even though it doesn't feel like it. And they might not like it. You already heard earlier what the price of leadership is. It's getting your names called, whatever, getting shunned. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally. If you know you're doing the right thing, that's why it's so important to have a community around you like this, a good family community if you can have one, to make sure that you still have people, you still have a connection. But if you are living right and saying no to the things you should be saying no to, you're already leading in your community. And if you have a group of friends who are coming and saying, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, you're like, I don't, if they feel like they can come to you and whisper, like, I don't like it either, then you're definitely leading, because now you have followers. You're not just taking a walk. But that comes from you actually knowing what you stand for and living it. And I'm not saying don't be afraid to make a mistake, try this or that, but be judicious. Think about it. Is that really a good idea? Should I go to that? Should I go along with this? Do I know that I have to tell a little lie in my soul in order to get along with this? And if the answer is yes, I'll just tell you, every time you lie to fit in, you've sold a piece of your soul. Every single time. It doesn't matter. You can get a lot of it back if it's these little kind of lies and whatever through time. You can repent. That's actually what you're here to do. And get right with it again and grow in character. But if you're acting that way and you're willing to disagree with the crowd, you're probably already leading. I'll just add, since I meant to say this in my other remarks and I've forgotten, you've now brought it up, so thank you so much. Here is a characteristic of a leader: being willing to be alone. If you're not willing to be lonely, you're not ready to lead. Because you're going to have to go out ahead, you're going to have to go against the grain, you're going to have to go against the world, you're going to have to go against the current, and you're going to be alone. It's not just attacked, you're going to be alone. And if you have to find inside yourself, so this is a spiritual thing for you on your own time. Find inside of yourself, like we heard earlier, talk to the pastor. You have to know who you are. You have to know what your purpose is. You have to know what you're here to do. And then you'll have that confidence in yourself to where you can actually be a leader even with these pressures all around you. Anybody else? No? Okay. Yay. Thank you.